This is not going to be a webinar in which we're instructional. Our webinars with the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows are very much about having discussions and dialogue. So we want to exchange ideas, we want to dive deeply into topics, and we really don't want to replicate what other people already do very well in terms of instructional webinars. This is really about linking the community in terms of ideas, helping us look forward, into new realms that CI can enter into, challenging old assumptions as well. So so I do hope that you'll participate in this very actively, in addition to joining us. And so please feel free to ask questions. Please feel free to share your thoughts as you wish. Okay, and insofar as we can, depending on how large the size is, I will also try to allow people to speak, but that might this is our first go around, so so we may need to tweak that a little bit. So please be patient with us if that's not launching properly. But anyway, so we'll get started. And as I said, this is a conversation, so this really isn't a presentation per se. You will see that Craig and I will have the slide deck here, but we also want to make sure that that this is just a group conversation. So I'm Cynthia Cheng Correia. I'm the president of the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows, for those of you who don't know me or the fellows. And so I am a practitioner in a formal sense in a past life, but I'm a process consultant, so I basically help people enhance their intelligence capabilities through process evaluation and design, as well as training. I'm also an academic, so I have one foot in academia. I teach at Simmons University, a competitive intelligence course that I've been teaching for well over a decade, and a number of other things as well. But in a nutshell, that's what I am, who I am in the CI world. And I want to turn this over to my other fellow and practitioner / academic, Craig, to talk about his interests and background.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. I'm a lot like Cynthia in many respects, having my foot probably over a couple of different places. Many of you will know me from the academic world, where I spent the better part of 3 decades serving in a variety of roles, but always teaching CI along that time. And one of the few people that's actually developed degree programs and executive courses, as well as some of the subject matter content that actually is often instructed in classrooms where CI is being presented. Most people generally, though, know me for my writing. I've done a few books, and usually in areas like competitive analysis. I've done probably, I don't know, I lost count somewhere, but maybe 7 or 8 kind of CI specific books. And I also write, and a lot of people don't know this about me, I also write in the business and public policy and business communications fields as well, where the rest of my books actually sit. But I am, as Cynthia mentioned, I'm the vice president of the CI Fellows. Very excited. We've got a wonderful group of folks, many of whom actually are going to be on with us today, and we're thrilled to have them here. We're trying to really promote the field. So on that note, I'm going to pass it back to Cynthia. She kind of just describes who we are and what we're doing, and then we're going to jump right into the good interactive stuff of the day.
Terrific, thanks, Craig. And I also want to mention, as a bit of housekeeping, that we are recording this webinar. So for those of you who want to review it, or perhaps down the line share it with folks, it'll be available as well. So, so just a note about that. And a little bit about the council, because the Competitive Intelligence Fellows have been around actually for decades, for at least 20 years, almost 30, but it has not been formalized into the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows until last year. And so we are a not-for-profit organization, and our mission is to sustain the CI discipline, to support it in terms of the service to the profession and service to the profession itself and service to the professional. So we mean to advance it through our work as ambassadors, champions, mentors, and educators, and supporting the various facets of the CI community. And so our webinars is one way of doing it, and we'll also have various types of publications and collaborations with other groups like SLA's Competitive Intelligence Division and academic institutions as well. So please look out for that for those of you who are interested. And our members span the globe, so our interests span the globe, and you'll see that as well in our programming and content. So please stay tuned and stay plugged in. You can join us on Twitter. We're at the CI Fellows, as you can see on your screen. And we also have a public group in LinkedIn, the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows group. So please join that as well if you want to stay plugged in about our programming, our various announcements. And those are also often on our website as well. So, please consider joining us and helping to enrich our community as well. And so a bit about the CI 2020 series of which this webinar is a part. Craig and I have been doing this for, what, 2 years now, Craig, right?
Right.
And this is a series of ongoing conversations that was actually started with the SLA CI division. They had invited us to speak and provide an overview about the state of CI. And this rolled into various types of webinars and in-person sessions at SLA's annual conferences. And so we've also presented at Skip Europe. They kindly invited us as well. And we're continuing this through the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows. And through these conversations, we've explored what's been shaping CI. And we also the question of, have we already come as far as we can in terms of our contributions to organizations? Have we hit that high water mark? And where will we go? And that last question is really a big one. And this particular webinar is a continuation of that. And we imagine that we'll be continuing this conversation because there are so many facets we haven't yet explored. And today, rather than talking about the general landscape as we have been, Craig and I have decided we want to focus on community. And then in the future, we'll talk about other facets like technology and others that really will be driving us. So, Craig, do you want to say a few words about our journey so far?
Yeah, I'll say a few of them. This is a journey, and I'm not real sure where the final destination is going to be, but I can tell you this, especially because this is a community, that final destination is ultimately going to be shaped by all of us, or at least it can be shaped by all of us. I know certainly from many of our views who have been in this community for a long, long time, all of us kind of hope for better days ahead. Not that they're good, bad, or otherwise today, although we'll delve into that conversation. But I think a lot of us see promise in it. And even in the initial sessions that we held that you've got listed up here, there was no lack of optimism in the room. Having said that, there was also no lack of realism. So that's where we're going to have I think an interesting and hopefully enriched conversation and discussion, even starting in the next few minutes.
Yes. Because one of the things that has driven this is that we've been having a lot of these conversations between fellows and practitioners. And as we do this, folks have said, well, gee, it'd be great if we could bring this conversation to other people. And so this really is a way of doing that and of bringing folks into this conversation. And pardon me. And so I think that what's really important here is for us to understand that this is really about conversations that will propel our practices. And as Craig said, really taking a hard look also at where we are so that we can craft that, our paths forward much more clearly and with more confidence as well. So for this particular session, we want to explore what and who we are, where are we, and where are we headed. And let's start with something a bit controversial, right? Because Craig and I were talking about this. We actually talk about this frequently, but as recently as yesterday, where we have folks saying, well, basically CI is dead, right? CI, it's a bust. Its heyday is gone, and there really is no such thing as the profession, and maybe not even a practice because there's so much fragmentation in CI. So let's take a look at that question first and let's get started. And to that, I just want to say, long live CI. Now you see it differently, but let's dive into this. So Craig, do you want to talk a little bit more about what you see in conversations with folks and various perspectives.
Absolutely. So, this is actually a question we've polled people on at a couple of our meetings. Most recently, you mentioned that we did that at a Special Libraries Association meeting, their annual meeting, as a matter of fact, and there was a pretty good audience in the room, probably numbering 80 to 100 people. So when we did that poll, we tried to understand whether the folks in there actually saw it as being kind of on the ascendancy. Maybe it's at a, kind of just a neutral point. Maybe it's actually at what we call the asymptotic point. It's kind of at the top of the curve and it's trying to figure out whether it's going to go backwards or forwards or not. And then there were some that continue to see it on the ascendancy as well. And it's a very mixed crowd. And the reason why you tend not to have an absolute answer to any of this has to do with you mentioned it earlier, we've got such a fragmented community. So if those people had been talking about it and they came in from certain industries, clearly CI is very alive and well in industries like biopharma. It's alive and well in aerospace and defense. It's alive and well in insurance. There's a number of industries where CI practice at a minimum, and arguably CI practitioners are very, very robust. And then there's some industries where maybe it's not quite as active. We don't have meetings, we don't have community discussions, we don't have groups of people that are actually convening around CI. The other key difference for me, at least, Cynthia, is I see some geographic differences as well. Many of you may know I do travel quite a bit around the world speaking about CI, and on any given year I'm probably in two to three dozen different countries. If you're talking about CI in places like Brazil, and I know we've got someone from Brazil on this, we were speaking to them right before we loaded up today. Places like Portugal, places like Correia and China, to some degree in the UK, Israel certainly. Some of those countries, there is still a lot of activity around CI. Maybe in certain other countries, there has been a so-called lessening of activity. Now, I might argue the two countries that I represent, some of you know, I'm a dual Canadian American citizen. Canada and the US, well, maybe it has somewhat tampered down in recent years. So the two things I would just throw out there, Cynthia, to get the conversation started, I think some industries, it's more alive and well than others. And I think in certain geographic locations, it's more alive in certain ones than others. So I'll leave that out to the crowd.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we see, and I just want to build a little bit more on the fragmentation of this, because like you said, there are various groups in which CI is still very robust. So for example, with SLA CI division, we have a lot of that. We have a lot of folks who are doing very robust CI research. That's going on. And we have some fields like legal in which things are growing. And so I think it's very important that we recognize that. And I think for a lot of folks too, I think we're still wedded to the idea of CI being centralized and being top down. And so when compared to that, the current environment may not seem so crisp, may not seem so organized. However, when we look at the reach of CI and how far CI has reached within organizations and within industries, we have a lot of people who have split functions now. And so they may not identify themselves as CI professionals per se or purely. However, they are still very much practicing CI. And so in some senses, they've been masked by that. So this is really more about the maturity, I would say, or evolution of CI. And whoops. But did you all hear me with that?
No, I think it was muted temporarily there.
Oh, sorry about that. So I was talking about how with the fragmentation and folks having split functions, that CI is actually has evolved, and in fact is maybe a sign of its maturity, that it has a broader reach even if it's not centralized anymore. And so I think when we cast a perspective, or perhaps wanting to view CI from a centralized perspective, it does look like it's dead. But when we look at it in the way that it's really practiced, we realize it has a much broader reach, as you say, geographically, but also in terms of various functions within organizations as well and across industries.
So I'd like to add another lens to this as well. There's always been what, generally kind of what we consider four, CI practice communities. So for example, you've got the public sector side of intelligence that we've had in the so-called intelligence communities for forever in many different countries. We've always had the side that Cynthia, you, I, and many of the folks on the call, that being representing the commercial, private sector, business enterprise side of the equation. But there's also been two other sides. You also have the academic side, again, one that, certainly you and I have had some exposure to, where, again, we could have a pretty long discussion about whether it's actually on the ascendancy, descendancy, or maybe somewhere in between. And last but not least, there's always been a community, again, one that some of us on this call have a lot of involvement with, the consulting community, the software community, all of the, so-called professional services that exist in the ecosystem. And here again, you wonder whether that is growing, shrinking, or otherwise. And a lot of that depends on how you actually define CI. As we've talked about, that definition, and I'm watching in the chat we've got going on here in the background,
Yes.
there are differences depending on where you're at. You could be in one country and CI could be defined differently. And Cynthia, you and I have had this conversation before. I'll be sitting in a group of C-suite executives and you ask them, what capabilities do you expect to be delivered by your CI staff to the same group of executives, and you're going to get a wide range of views of what it's supposed to deliver, what it's supposed to influence, the kinds of benefits that it might actually bring even within a single organization. So as long as we have these, so-called fragmentations, we're going to have a mighty difficult time answering the question actually on the slide.
Yes, absolutely. And I do want to point people to the chat as well. We have folks who are weighing in. And so Alan Naylor is pointing out that the CI is very robust in Silicon Valley, specifically in high tech. And Jean-Francois observes it's a lot less in low tech manufacturing areas. Ellen also says some executives don't know what CI is. And so so there are still some inherent barriers built into this that either color perceptions, but also impact how we practice and how we get the word out. And actually, there's also a question that Raji has asked: in areas where it's allegedly dying, what replaces it? So I want to bookmark that actually, because I know Craig and I have that. We do want to talk about that and dive into that a little bit more deeply. But absolutely. And Jean-Francois mentioned maybe he has a branding problem. And that's a part of it too that we've noticed over time. People have been sensitive to the term, but as CI has become part of its split functions, that branding becomes more difficult because CI is not necessarily pure CI. In some organizations, it's market intelligence. Some organizations, it's strategic intelligence. In some organizations, it's also now a part of data analysis, right? And so we have now various facets. So what is it? And so these are just some things that we want to talk about. We're not going to arrive at any answers today, but this is something that these are all the different various questions that we want to work on as the council, as the community, and work towards solutions as well. So, but yeah, some terrific thoughts here that I'm seeing on the chat. And so with the evolution of the CI community, you want to ask questions like, how is the community supporting intelligence practices in the field? But with all of these uncertainties in a broader VUCA world, as Craig has just outlined, how are we doing that? Is it just about providing good CI, or do we have to do a lot more to define what CI is and all those various issues that are being brought up in the chat? How do we support the practices? And then how do we stay current when it is fragmented? Back in the day, right, Craig knows this well because he was a leader. We had SCIP. It was the Society of Competitive Intelligence Professionals. And now we have SCIP plus a number of different other organizations and entities. So how do we keep up when there are many channels? And then how can we take effective action? So those are just some things for us to think about in chat, in this discussion and beyond. You can take it where you like. But in terms of the evolution of the CI community, I just want to you to share this too, that with the centralized top-down to a decentralized embedded, it doesn't just affect companies anymore, it also affects the community itself as we are focused on industries and so forth. So Craig, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, you know, for the longest time, I remember when I did my very first study for SCIP, and this was back in the late 80s. I was doing it in 1987, 1980. We published it in 1889. It was something called, you know, SCIP, Who We Are and What We Do. We had about 380, if I remember, kind of respondents to that. So it was a pretty big one at the time. Actually, maybe it was the biggest. You know, and one of the questions we asked, and now I kind of cringe as I say this, you know, are you organized in a centralized or decentralized fashion, as if those were the only two ways to organize CI? And today, I don't think we'd even ask that question. I'm not sure it's as important. You know, what I see as having been more important, number one, is a lot of CI roles and responsibilities are certainly, and again, I won't call them centralized, decentralized, but they're dispersed, they're fragmented, they're dispersed, and they're shared. And they're shared in ways through technology that we just didn't have available to us 30 years ago. You know, I see a lot of CI practice being done in groups and teams. I see it being done, quote unquote, 365 by 24 by 7, by not just in technology realms, digital realms, but also between people. The really best companies, the really best so-called best practice operators have figured out how to make their research, make their data gathering work for them, you know, literally, you know, real time, globally. They do this very well. They share it. It's humans plus technology. And so therefore, like this question of whether we should centralize it or decentralize it, for me, is maybe it's a relic of the past. And maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. We practice it so differently. And a lot of our folks now see, you know, CI is a part of everybody's job. You know, some of the companies that I know perform at higher levels, they actually literally, you know, if you come on board those companies, during your onboarding, you'll hear about the importance of CI. Someone will share that. Someone will share what your responsibilities will be. They'll talk about how you can actually, you know, not only share some of the things you're observing or rumors maybe you're hearing, but how you can also then, you know, extract it out of the system. So, you know, I see a lot more kind of multilateral, multi-directional, collaborative kind of work that includes both humans and technology.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm going back to the chat here as well, and you know, we have some, you know, really good inputs here, and I love how robust this is. In fact, I have to say I'm a bit challenged keeping up with the conversation here that's happening in parallel, and you know, it's really terrific because somebody here has also invoked education. And so, you know, that's also something that we want to, you know, talk a bit about as well, I think. But we have, you know, people who are talking about, you know, different cross functions, and yeah, you mentioned sales here as well. So seeing CI more and more occurring in product marketing, says Derek Johnson. So absolutely, I think you're absolutely right, Craig, in saying that, you know, maybe the question about decentralization, you know, isn't as important. And I think it's becoming less important because it's more embedded. It's just going to be, you know, merely more of an assumption that we will have a CI mindset. Right, across the organization. It doesn't just reside in a department. So what does this mean then to the community if we're going to be supporting CI? And we're not supporting just pure practitioners anymore, right? We're supporting people who have split functions. We're supporting people who might be contributors to CI internally. And those contributors need to be ramped up about CI, you know, in terms of practice and ethics and so forth. So how do we as practitioners and the broader community support that? And how do we support the users as well? So these are dimensions that we really haven't delved much into before. And perhaps we need to take a closer look at that if we want to establish CI more firmly. And we also want to establish best practices across all the various players that are contributing. So, and so with the CI community, we just want to recognize you know, that with the community itself, that there are also a number of different adjacent practices, and that's in green in the slide that you see here. And so with with that, we see market intelligence up at the top green right hand green bubble. We have industries going clockwise. Folks who are in strategic functions, security and technology, and then so these are various other practices that overlap with CI. And so some folks are actually conducting CI and they're contributing towards CI practices. And if we're not paying attention to that, then we're not doing CI community justice. So Craig, I think you want to say something about that.
Yeah, there's two of those bubbles on there that just every time I see this, I think, number one is media. If there's something that I think our community in general has done probably a bad job, and gosh, that's not an academic word, but I don't think we've done a good job helping the media generally understand who we are and what we do and why we have benefits to offer our companies, our organizations, our industries, our society, et cetera, et cetera. The media, when they talk about us and when they talk about what we do, they're not talking about us and what we do. They're talking about the Hollywoodization of it. They're talking about, all of the illegal stuff, anything that can, quote unquote, sell print inches and, get 30 seconds of good advertising in support of it. It's all it's all of that, highfalutin stuff that's generally either illegal, unethical, or both. So we don't do that, and yet we've got some really, and there's people on this chat right now. We've got compelling stories and narratives to share where CI has been a significant, dramatic, and substantial difference maker in how we helped our organizations save money, save jobs, produce products and services that customers value far more highly. We're often working with those sales and product engineers and R&D folks to make sure that what they actually are working on, so-called back in the labs or in the skunk works, actually works out in the marketplace. I mean, that's a powerful narrative, and yet we haven't done a good job telling it. The other bubble, by the way, I did say I had two. The other one that I've seen us struggle with for years is users. And I remember through the years, Skip has always tried to bring in C-suite participants who have, valued and benefited from CI. Some years we did a good job of that, and I can remember going back to Bob Galvin, CEO of Motorola. We've had Procter & Gamble CEO come in. I mean, we've had a number of larger CEOs, large company CEOs come in and kind of share, well, CI matters, this is why, and I love to hear those. Here's where I'm going to throw the caveat out. We don't hear enough of them, and we need to hear more of them. We need to be listening to them, and we need to be hearing from them. Not to mention talking to them. So there needs to be this two-way communication, I think, out in the community proper, not just within our companies. And oh, by the way, if that's not happening in your company, that's another area or opportunity for improvement. But we have not done a good job at dialoguing with our users any better, I think, than we've done with the media.
Absolutely. So they're getting their impressions of CI from the media. And so that makes our jobs a whole lot harder. And there are also other bubbles that we see here. We have practitioners at the top and educators and associations at the bottom, that really make up that, the core of the community. So we do want to acknowledge that with educators, that bubble also includes academics as well as various certificate programs and private trainers like the Institute of Competitive Intelligence and the Academy of Competitive Intelligence and certificates programs from SCIP and SLACI division. So, and then that's on one side. And then on the other side, we have academic institutions that are providing education as well, either through courses like the one that I offer at Simmons University or through full programs like that at Mercyhurst. So, so it's important for us to recognize that those are contributors to the community as well. And then the associations, of course, just starting with SCIP, but SLACI division, and various others that have have expressed interest in it. So sometimes we have the Association of Strategic Professionals, ASP, covering CI, right, and through some webinars, and so we have to look beyond just the core of our community as well. And all those impressions, all those touches matter, right, to how people view CI and to what this community is. And so it's, again, it is fragmented. And so how do we want to wrap ourselves around that? And how do we want to support it as well? So there's some things to think about there. So with that, do we take a broader definition of CI? Seeing the green bubbles that are there, the associated practices. Other questions that come up too is what sort of public benefit, and I think Craig, you already touched on that a bit, right? In terms of media perception and users, and of course the general public, and so if we can help define what CI is, away from spying, right, which is the perennial struggle, and there's certainly that benefit. But Craig, you've had some thoughts on other benefits as well.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, again, that's been, if you think about any long-standing profession, Cynthia, people know what nurses do. They know the benefits that a nurse brings. You think about engineers, you think about lawyers, you think about doctors. People get it. There's an inherent sense of what good they do. But now replace doctor or engineer with CI practitioner. Most people don't know who we are. They certainly probably even less know about our benefits. They don't know about our certifications, as is going on in the chat right now.
Yes.
It's these benefits. We have not done a good job. I think in general, me included, obviously, of articulating the social benefit of CI. And it gets to that last question you have here in the bubble, and it says, what happens if CI were to go away? And I remember, I did an experiment with a client back probably about 20 years ago now. We actually stopped performing certain CI services that had been long-standing in this particular organization. It was a large financial services organization. And we stopped doing some of the CI activities. I'll give you an example of one of the ones we stopped in this particular case. They sent out a weekly newsletter to their executives, and they stopped doing it. And the question we asked ourselves is, would anyone actually notice that it wasn't being distributed? Would anyone scream? Would anyone come, hey, I'm missing my newsletter, please get it sent over, and did I get off the list? And the reality is you're probably already sensing most of the things that they stopped doing, nobody noticed. It was like crickets in the room, nobody listening. If a tree falls in the forest, does anyone hear it? Well, that's kind of what happened. Now, the good news was a couple of the things that they stopped doing, people inquired about and people wanted to know about, and they started getting concerned that they weren't doing it. So, I mean, that was one of the earlier ways, and I was doing this as part of a project to try to measure so-called return on the CI investment, back when in the day. We didn't come up with some, probably algorithmic or, formulaic numbers to do that, but we certainly realized at least where our customers or our clients inside our organizations actually valued us or knew we were doing stuff, or frankly maybe needed things that that they were unaware of. There's always that we know what you do and we don't know what you do, but there's also we don't know what we don't know about what you do. So kind of the 4 boxes of knowing, I think, applies a lot to CI, and a lot of executives, you could go through those 4 boxes of knowing relative to CI in an organization, and executives are going to fill up all 4 boxes with you.
Absolutely. And I love the fact that you brought up about the unknowns and unknowns, because it makes me wonder, it makes me think about the fact that very often, this is sort of the shoemaker's children analogy, where we're conducting CI for other people and we're supporting CI in various organizations, but how well are we conducting CI for CI? Right, and we run into that problem before. Various associations have run into that problem in the past, where they weren't necessarily protecting themselves with the very skills and the very tools that we have at our disposal. And so I think that it's important for us to apply that. And then one other thing about CI going away, Craig, is that we talked about this recently. Now if CI weren't there, the need will still be there. And so who will fill that need? And we talked about how, in that gap, if there are no CI practitioners, or if their practitioners are not recognized, as CI practitioners per se, then we run the risk of other folks filling that gap. And Craig, you brought up the point about, say, PIs, right, private investigators coming in and filling that gap because people don't know any better and won't, to call somebody who is a CI practitioner who practices with the ethical responsibilities of that. So what happens if we have organizations that are reaching out to those that don't have the discipline that we've developed within the CI community? So Craig, what do you want to add to that? Because that was a really robust part of our conversation the other day.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a long problem. So I mentioned earlier when the media picks it up. So, I get, probably like many of the folks on this, on our discussion today, I get people reaching out all the time, whether it's through Twitter or LinkedIn or wherever else they can find me at. And they say, we need somebody to do this. Is that what you do as a CI person? Most of what I hear people asking for is not what I would do as a CI person. They're asking us to hack something. They're asking us to get details either in unethical or illegal fashion, sometimes both. And that's problematic. Now, by the way, what they're going to end up doing then is, their boss told their purchasing person to find somebody to go do this illegal or unethical behavior. Somebody's going to do it. And they're going to all think about this as having been done by a CI person. I don't consider PI equal CI. That's my view. By the way, do I know PIs who also do CI? Yeah, I happen to know a few. Actually, we've got one or two of those in the fellows community. But they at least recognize the difference between private investigation activity and competitive intelligence activity. There is not just a fine line. There's a very stark black and white line between those kinds of activities. In some cases, there's legal restrictions to one being done by certain people and the other being done by certain people. So this has been an ongoing problem, it seems to me. And as long as the people that are doing it right and well and in superior fashions don't speak up about it, what's going to come to the fore are those people that are making a mess of it. It's the muck. It's the folks that are in the mud. It's the bad apples ruining the whole barrel. And that's generally what the media is going to pick up on those so quickly. It's like bees on honey. And it's going to take a lot longer, a lot harder for them to even find those of us that are in the trenches doing it day in and day out, and making incremental and sometimes spectacular kinds of gains for organizations.
Absolutely. And I think that it's really important for us to recognize this what if question, so that we can understand the value that we offer and how we might be able to, well, branding has been a part of the chat that I see here, but how we might help to define who we are and the various ways that we can shore up the understanding of the value of CI. And to your point, there are folks who are good, who are great practitioners, and who stay within the ethical boundaries. And incidentally, not just ethical boundaries in U.S. or North America, because nowadays we're more challenged in a global world to understand ethics from a number of different cultural and geographic perspectives. And so that's another value that we offer. And so I think it helps to redefine the types of services and the dimensions of these services that we can contribute towards the community and obviously to our users. Because just on ethics alone, if we are a global firm, or perhaps we have folks who are maybe even entering our market from overseas, we've got folks who may have a different ethical practice or impression. So, for example, I think an easy one is that if we're conducting management analysis and we have folks in North America conducting it, well, we have our own ground rules and ethical boundaries. In Europe, we're constrained more by privacy laws, and so there are certain things that you can't do in Europe that you can do in the United States, and then other parts of the world, it's even Wild West. I mean, there are no real rules, and ethical perceptions are much squishier, and so as CI practitioners, understanding this, we help to protect our own organizations in terms of where we draw our boundaries in conducting intel overseas, but also in protecting as other folks are targeting us. And so these are all the various questions that are arising in the global world, in the VUCA world, that we need to be able to define and promote to the users. And so I just offer that as one example. To areas that we haven't been serving or we've been underserving, that we might be able to use, to help define what CI is, and to also help, to highlight its value.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember going back, probably back about 2 decades, and we had our first CI ethics task force within SCIP. It actually resulted in a book that we published back in the late 90s, a bunch of articles in what was CI magazine at the time. And we reran another community-based effort, probably in the middle of Y2K, so maybe 2005, 2006. And I apologize if I'm a year or two off on the actual date, where as a community, and actually a lot of the CI fellows were involved in this effort, we came together to try to answer what we called those frequently asked questions. So when executives or clients of CI were asking, so what is it that you can and can't do, or you shouldn't do? They asked a lot of those questions. We ended up with about, 24, I think was the number of questions that we worked on to try to understand some of the best practices. And we had to do this globally, but that was 12 years ago. A lot's changed since that time. And if you think about it, 12 years ago, Facebook was just coming on board. We didn't really have a lot of robust social media. A lot of what we use today, the analytics, the technology, the digitization, et cetera, the collaboration, the communication platform, none of those were really kind of robust at the time. Well, they are today. And we have a lot of, multinational, cross-national, transnational kinds of issues that we as CI practitioners face that we probably couldn't have envisioned 12 years ago. So I would think at some point in the nearer future, the CI fellows and hopefully those of us that have an interest in that in the broader community, we'll come back together and revisit those to understand really how those changes impact our practice, in the ways that we should and shouldn't be doing it.
Absolutely. And I just want to know, we're actually, I know that these webinars, these fellows webinars are meant to do deeper dives and to also touch on topics that are not commonly discussed out in the community. And I just feel that we're still, even though 2 years in to the CI 2020 series, we're still just scratching the surface, right? This is just the tip of all that I think, needs to be done or can be done. And so with that, I'm going to advance this and talk about. We've already actually talked about so many of these slides, these facets on the slide here. The practice, ethics, and so forth. But I do note that folks have been bringing up analytics and in the chat. And so that's an aspect that we really do need to train our sights on. It's already affecting us. And well, I don't think the singularity is near. And so we're not going to be cyborged into Intel or CI just yet. But there's still a lot that we need to grapple with. And analytics, introduces new questions to our practices, to our functions, to roles, obviously tools, and also to ethics, and then security. So really, it's at the center of all of that you see here. It touches on everything, and it also affects the information ecosystem. And I'll just lay out the slide a little bit, but around that is also the body of knowledge, right, surrounding all of these. And so in the absence of a community, where is that body of knowledge for practice? And so it's really important that we understand this community and be able to find ways of tying in the various fragments or the various channels of practices that are happening, so that we can be connected, we can be linked, and best practices that can be shared and arise out of that. So, Craig, I'll turn that over to you.
Yeah, this is another area. That body of knowledge is so fragmented today. And this goes back to another initiative that I was involved with back in the middle of last decade. We actually, with SCIP, we're developing the CI Foundation at the time. We're developing a body of knowledge project. Most recently, that body of knowledge, I think in 2013 or 14, reached its fourth volume. So there was an attempt, for better and for worse, to try to capture what that is. Now all of us know in any great professional field, like I believe CI, could and should be, the body of knowledge is ever evolving, and that's usually where our academic part of the community can really help us understand, where the scope is changing. This is another area that I think we could do much better in. We probably need to relook at what Skip has most recently done. At some point, I know we've got a couple of fellows, by the way, one of whom's on the chat right now. You know who I'm talking about, Louis. Who are really trying to, get a grasp of, the frameworks that we need to know. And I also see in the chat we're having a really interesting conversation. The body of knowledge now requires us to have new competencies in areas that we don't provide in training programs, at least on the business private sector side. To some degree, they do it on the public sector side, but of course that's very proprietary for those agencies. So where I'm going with this, it's going to be hard to develop the next generation of practitioners if we don't know what that evolving and evolved body of knowledge actually is. And if we don't really know what it is, then how are we going to generate that, develop that next generation? How are we going to develop the current generation of practitioners that's having to deal with the marriage, as we're talking about in the chat, the marriage of the qualitative and the quantitative, the analytics and the communication, the research and the analytics? I mean, these are on continuums, and there's so many fragmented continuums of skills and capabilities that a great CI professional ultimately could master for their organization's benefits.
Absolutely. And it's so what you're saying is that it goes beyond just the challenge of current practitioners trying to understand what's to come and preparing ourselves for it, but really preparing the next generation. And I think you and I as educators, we struggle with that a lot, right? How much to include, how much to teach and what to teach, and because you still need the foundational learning. In fact, one of the things that I encountered recently, I was speaking at an industry conference, and it was a series of workshops, day long, and broken down into various workshops. And mine was the very last one on ethics. And I polled the group because I needed to understand where they are at in terms of CI understanding practices and skills. And I asked them how familiar they are with the Intel process model. And not a person raised their hand. And that was extremely telling for me. It was also troubling, but it was very telling for me, not just in terms of how I was going to present the ethical discussion, because the framework is a good touchstone, but the fact that people have gone through a day-long series of workshops on CI how-tos and the Intel process model, and none of the functions really came up, means that there are gaps in training, in professional development. And so how do we approach that? Because if there are those types of gaps, there could be gaps in ethics, there could be gaps in other areas. And how does this bear on CI community and the broader practice, practice community? So we really need to be examining this, because I think that this is happening as CI becomes decentralized, and you have various functions and associations that are geared to those functions taking on the tasks of training, but they're not necessarily bringing in long-standing CI practitioners who have that foundational knowledge. They're bringing in folks who are a part of that community, who have learned a smattering of CI, and not necessarily looking at CI deeply, comprehensively, and understanding the implications of CI practice as well, so that they can shore up their practice on an offensive and defensive basis. So, and then that's not even addressing the analytics and the data analytics and potentially AI aspect as well, because that's just completely out of the scope of these folks, and that actually came up in the ethical discussion as well. So, I'm really encouraged to see that a lot of the folks in the chat are attuned to this, and but it makes me wonder, what are we going to do about it? So, so with that. We also want to mention too, let's address the information ecosystem, Craig, because we were talking about misinformation, disinformation. We've had a series of conversations about these that also have serious implications to how we practice. and what this means to our community and who we are. And so, we were talking about, I'll just launch right into it. We were talking about deep fakes yesterday, right?
Yeah.
And the implications of that. I mean, that is already happening. And so it's happening in the political realm primarily, but it's not going to take much for this to cross over into commercial, especially since we have different ethical parameters around the world. And so what does this mean? What does this mean in terms of, and deep fakes, by the way, are videos primarily of individuals saying things, but it's not really that individual. It's just basically an avatar of that individual, but they're really using their image. And through artificial intelligence, narrow AI, we're able to manipulate people's video images so that they're saying things that we want them to say, not that they actually said. So what does this mean in terms of intelligence collection? Right? If we're encountering a video and someone says X, Y, Z, do we take that literally, or how deeply do we have to investigate that? And I can foresee a time when people are going to be pranking, if you will, CEOs, right? Pranking various folks in industry, and I just use that word, almost tongue in cheek, because obviously the implications are much deeper than that. So how are we prepared for that? Because we're already encountering misinformation and disinformation in text, right, spread throughout social media, and that's something that we need to confront, I think, more deeply as well. But how do we handle this entire sort of sub-ecosystems of bad information and bad data? Yeah.
That's become so important, and whether it's fake news, fake data. It's funny. Our field began even before we had groups like Skip dealing with misinformation, dealing with deception, dealing with dishonesty. We most of us were trained to be able to spot that, to account for it, and then to make sure that at least we factor that into the deliverables that we produced for our executives, for our decision makers and leaders. We haven't lost that. We're still good at that. It's just now there's so much more of it. The volume comes out at a pace that's maddening. And there are people out there, the bad guys, so to speak, and I use that euphemistically, of course. The bad guys out there will always leave, those of us that are, trying to share truth to power in honest and valid ways. And we have to keep ahead of them. This is a place I think we can play an increasingly important professional role in our organizations. Our decision makers, our executives are often shielded from the truth. They're often given multiple truths from multiple people in multiple places. I can't tell you how many organizations I've worked with through the years that had numerous people that claimed they were providing CI insights to the executive team, and most of those actually had nothing or little to do with CI. So these are all areas I think that we can take the lead on. I mean, who better than CI pros to really help our organizations deal with truth decay and deep fakes and alternative facts and news. And there's no shortage of this. This stuff's going to grow. And don't think for a second that, you've mentioned already a number of times, Cynthia, and I'm so in agreement with this. There are actors globally that will have counter interest to whatever and wherever you are acting in your organization is. There will be folks out there that will be willing to use all of these wonderful technological advancements for your ill will and harm. Like it or dislike it, that's an empirical reality of the marketplace. It's an empirical reality of kind of sociopolitics. So, if that's not going to go away, we're in a great position to influence and filter and to clean up and to make sure that our executives really understand what is true from what isn't. And again, if we need to be loud and proud about that, I think within our organizations, we need to call, excuse me for using an acronym here, we need to call BS when we see BS. If it smells like a duck and walks like a duck, it's probably a duck, and somebody needs to tell people that there's a duck, that's walking into their decision-making calculus.
Because there is harm in not doing it. I think that it's a form of professional malpractice, right? To shirk from that. So absolutely, I think sometimes we need to have that impact, and language be damned. But I also want to point out that Louise had mentioned too that this is also an opportunity. Fake and bad data and information overload is starting to make companies realize that they need insights, and so that is something that can help us even brand ourselves. And Christina DeBritta has mentioned hosting information literacy sessions in-house, right? To be able to bring this awareness in-house. And actually, Suki had posted something here that I really loved, calling discernment a mega skill. And so I absolutely love that. Terrific. And so with that, it's just, I think it's so important for us to understand that education, pointing to the previous slide, comes into play here. And I don't mean just education academically, education from the standpoint of professional development. And so as a community, because we don't have a primary channel any longer, we tend to have multiple channels. How are we going to approach this? Where do we even find these opportunities? How do we communicate this need? So these are questions that are really out there that are still unanswered. And then also, how do we gather best practices in each of these areas? Lori, I think, had mentioned earlier, time is a factor. And so when we're talking about multiple channels and all of these various facets and dimensions for us, to keep up on our practices, well, how do we do that in an efficient way? And current awareness is also another aspect of that, across multiple channels, right, with all these time pressures. And but I do think that there are some opportunities here through the wisdom of the crowd, right, things surfacing up and using our colleagues. I know I can't stay on top of everything, and so I rely on colleagues like Craig and others, as others rely on me, to be their eyes and ears. And so I think that, to be able to identify our colleagues who are on top of each of these various areas, who are specialized in these areas, specialized in terms of practices, but also geographically, becomes more important than ever before. There was a time where we could follow maybe just a couple of thought leaders and stay on top of it, or just maybe attend, one annual conference. And nowadays, we really have to choose, where we go and what we do, but also network becomes much more important. It's not just a matter of having a few of these expert practitioners or specialists at our disposal or as a part of our contact, but their own networks. And so the networks of networks become more important, because we never know when there is going to be a need, and to be able to tap into that very easily. So how will we do that? I mean, one other thing I want to mention too in that orange box is trust. The fact that, as a part of the community, important part of communities is trust. It's not just a matter of we can trust CI pros if you're a user or if you're a society, but we need to be able to trust one another as well. And so one of the things I want to mention that I love about the fellows community is that we actually have competitors in consulting and in this community, but we are also colleagues. And so there is trust there in the sense that, yeah, we may be competing on certain projects, but we know that we are still supporting one another, and we are supporting the greater community. And I do value that so much, because you can't take that for granted. And dare I say, we even have friendships that have developed over that, from that as well. And so, to me, that also deepens the trust, and it deepens how we might bring forward our practices. And so I would like to see that spread throughout the broader community as well. As we ask, what's next for CI? Do we want to say, okay, well, CI is in, is in the ashes, or do we want to rise like a phoenix? As I have on the graphic there on the screen. So
we've reached the end of the hour, and I know I want to make sure we retain the trust of everybody that's on our chat. I see some people that are needing to move on to other things. So let me just use this opportunity on behalf of you and the rest of the fellows just to thank everybody for participating today. This is the start of something we hope to be doing regularly. In 2 weeks, we're going to do a tweet cast that's going to follow up and build on this. We will get, in communication with everybody to let you know. It's going to be on February 6th at noon Eastern time under hashtag CI Fellows Chat. So be aware that that's going to allow us to continue this over there in Twitter land, and we're looking forward to having people involved. So I thank everybody. Wonderful, wonderful conversations going on in the chat windows as well as with us today.
Yeah, I know. I can't expect for more, and I love that because this is a sense of community that we get just from the chat alone. And I do want to mention in February we are going to kick off our global series of webinars, featuring Luis Madriguera and Rostik Hersky and our guest Graham Dixon. And so they will be talking about so representing Portugal and Canada and the UK, and obviously Europe as well. And so talking about CI practices in those geographies in comparison. And this is just a kickoff of our global series. So we'll be touching on various other geographies and other topics as well. Because again, we're going to be doing a deep dive, and these will be conversations. So these are not folks that are just putting presentations on you. So please keep that in mind. Also, we'll Craig and I will be appearing at the SLA annual conference in June and talking about this and picking up on that conversation focused on the info space. And we'll also have the CID, the SLA CI division webinars in November. We're slated to continue this as well. So please continue this conversation, and please stay in touch. Our contact information is there if you're not. And don't forget, the CI Fellows are also on Twitter and on LinkedIn. So plug in. And some of you are also receiving, signed up to receive notifications from us as well. So if you haven't done that yet and you're interested, please, by all means, drop us a note. You can contact me at the CI Fellows email address, and we can add you to the list. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for enriching this conversation through your chats. I think down the line it'd be great to be able to have people join us visually as well. But you've just been absolutely terrific, and I noticed that people were so engaged in chat, we actually forgot that there's a Q&A section, so none of it actually appeared in the Q&A. So, but we will look at the chat and look at some of the topics that you've brought up, because one of the things that Craig wants to do on the Twitter chat is to feature 5 or 6 topics, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so stay tuned for that notification. That will be posted to our LinkedIn as well as Twitter accounts, and we'll also post that to on our events calendar on the CI Fellows homepage. So thank you so much, and I have to say I'm so gratified, and I feel the warmth of the community through this session. And I look forward to many more. We will be publishing our monthly webinar calendar shortly. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day or evening.
Or evening. We're global.
That's right.
Yeah. Bye for now.
See you next time. Bye-bye, everyone.